Uncinderella by Susan Cinnamon, read by Ava Gallo. Mara felt badly when she'd heard the plane crashed. She figured she was the one who would die in a burning blaze of metal and propellers, not Paul. It was certainly one of her big fears, and she thought Paul was invulnerable. Her shock at hearing about the accident called to mind her surprise at seeing Paul with Paulette, the trophy wife he'd captured only a year after Paul divorced Mara. The bizarre coincidence that the new wife's name was Paulette paled in comparison to the extraordinary glamour she exuded. Paulette was not only stick-thin, a hanger as they call it in the modeling world Paulette was from, but her eyes were crystal blue like marbles, and her white skin was as luminous as an upscale chandelier from ABC Home and Carpet. Now Paul, the urologist, and Paulette, the former model, were reduced to being nothing more than the tiny particles that their maid would typically leave on the lampshades in their summer home on the vineyard, seeing that they'd just get all dusty from the sea air again so soon. The one remnant from the union of Paul and Paulette was little Cinderella, their golden trophy child. Paulette named her baby Cinderella because she wanted her daughter raised as a princess. The fact that the name referred to the cinders of a fireplace and a very downscale beginning seemed to escape Paulette. Cinderella had a big, hulking castle in Disney World, Mara remembered Paulette saying, and that would be the namesake of her daughter, no arguments. Mara didn't think of mentioning that it was Sleeping Beauty's castle which loomed over Disney World, since that would necessitate a conversation between herself and Paulette, which was not on the agenda as far as Mara was concerned. Knowing Paul, Mara felt sure that he too knew which princess castle was which, but the reason he never corrected Paulette seemed self-evident. Mara used to be afraid of correcting Paul about things, and now it seemed Paul was afraid of correcting Paulette. The circle of corrections, Mara wistfully thought to herself, sighed and went on to working on her sand painting. Cinderella was the half-sister of Mara's two daughters with Paul. Having no other relatives and a sizable fortune, Paul had stipulated in his will that Mara and her two daughters would move into the Belair mansion that was Cinderella's home, and look after Cinderella until she was of age. Mara prided herself on maintaining a congenial relationship with her ex and his beautiful wife, bowing and scraping as she secretly hoped for a token of their benevolence. Any little bit would help, as Paul had left Mara with no alimony and hardly any child support. He managed this because Mara hadn't fought the divorce, contracted no attorney, and yielded to all of Paul's wishes and requests. She chose to sit stony-eyed in a stupor of what appeared to be utter martyrdom and self-destruction, as Paul ripped the bosom of security and love from her body and left her with two young daughters to raise in a state of near poverty. Poor Mara. Janny and Kim, Mara's girls, were two different stories. Janny was dark with lustrous hair and a wide nose. Her swayback beckoned every manner of boy, and her joie de vivre was palpable. It was hard to imagine that her father was really Paul, as he had been tall and blonde, while Janny looked more like a Nubian princess, and couldn't care less about Paul, Paulette, or little Cinderella, ostensibly her half-baby sister. Kim was once the baby, but now found herself relegated to the lowly status of middle child in all its cliched forms. Ignored, unimportant, and desperate for attention, Kim overcompensated by becoming adept at motorcycles. She knew how to ride them, fix them, and carol all the men who loved them, with a fervor known only to the figures found in a movie genre of the 1950s, now long forgotten. Kim's body was covered in motorcycle tattoos. Some of the motorcycles sped across the hills and valleys of Kim's upper torso, while others parked on her butt or chest. Both girls were ferociously loyal to their mother, Mara. They moved into Paul's mansion for Mara's sake, but if they'd had it their way, they'd share an apartment in Silver Lake, riding, drinking, seeing improv, and waiting tables. Money held no allure for them, and the thought of their father Paul, whom they'd barely ever seen, held even less. The three girls and Mara, the stepmother, lived there once upon a time uneventfully. Mara cooked, Janny cleaned the mansion, and Kim chauffeured and landscaped. She was also a great mechanic and rode a mean tractor-trailer across the lawn. Cinderella played on her computer, her phone, and shopped. Her favorite store was Bendel's, but since moving out of New York, she'd hired a personal shopper who sent her what she needed. Feeling altruistic, Cinderella always threw away her used Chanel bottles near a Starbucks recycling bin, where less fortunate people could collect them and keep the labels as inspiration. "Kim, where's the car? Kim, I need the car vacuumed," Cinderella screeched. "Someone left their Starbucks stir thing on the seat. I do not want to have to return the car to the dealer. I like that car. Don't make me do something I don't want to do. That is not an experience I wish to have, if you quite understand me." Cinderella waited while Kim used the vacuum cleaner on the steering wheel and back seats of the car. "What's this?" Kim asked as she dug some glittery paper from underneath the passenger seat. Looking more closely, she read from what she could now see was an invitation on silver glitter paper. Cinderella, Kim, and Janny Anderson are invited to a cotillion for Everleigh Court, June 3rd, 2018. "What the heifer is a cotillion?" asked Kim. "Like, what in hell is a heifer? The way you two girls talk, you'd think you grew up in Burbank. It's disgusting. A cotillion is a dance, and clearly you and Janny are invited," corrected Cinderella. "If it's for Everleigh's Court, why isn't Ma invited? We all live here." "Everleigh's Court is a gated complex, half-sisters. Probably someone thought your mother was the cook and the maid, and probably she pretty much is. And probably you're pretty much the driver, and Janny is pretty much the laundress. But I guess since you're both sort of hot in a completely low-brow way, you managed to score an invitation. Someone will probably get fired for the miscalculation, but oh well. I have to go shopping." Janny and Kim decided to shop for themselves as well, and went to H&M where they found a couple of cute new outfits. They were modeling the skirts and crop tops for Mara when Cinderella waltzed down the long staircase of her house in a metallic and beaded gown from the house of Eloquista, the most elite fashion house in Europe. Janny and Kim rolled 4 eyes while Mara tried to look approvingly on Cinderella's gown. "Why aren't you bitches talking? Can't you see the price tag on this gown? You could get your MFA for what I paid for this. How did my father ever stand you, Mara? You're such a dolt." Mara thought deeply about the question posed to her by Cinderella. When Paul and Mara first met, there was a bit of a fairy tale about it all for them both. Walking down a city street, Mara walked smack into Paul, knocked him down, and broke his tooth and jaw. Paul was so disoriented, Mara felt it her duty to take him to the emergency room. While there, she fell madly in love with one of the interns, Dr. Absco Mwambi from Kenya. While Paul's jaw was being wired, Mara was making love to Dr. Mwambi in the moonlighting room. The tiny cot was like a warm cloud around them both, their black and white skins indiscernibly swaying and moving. "You're like a goddess," Absco whispered to Mara. "No, you are. A god, that is." "What am I?" Before she could finish her sentence, Janny was conceived, a perfect combination of the world's best molecules and a DNA destined to be loved by Mara with the same passion she had for her brief interlude with Mwambi. It was Mara's guilt that had left her penniless, not her grief over losing Paul's love. What looked like a stupor then in the lawyer's office during the divorce was really Mara lost in a daydream of herself and Dr. Mwambi making Janny, Mara recalled. Paul never had a clue about any of it and went on with the fairy tale of a love life with Mara and a dark-skinned baby girl who arrived prematurely. Yet somehow, he knew. Mara's girls watched her thinking hard and knew their mother had been transported to that place where neither of them dare ask about. They ignored Cinderella's insults as they assumed Mara would want them to do and left for the cotillion. Cinderella, waiting for a snappy comeback from Mara in answer to her insulting question, hung back. "Cinderella, you never mentioned anything to me about this dance at the condo complex." "Why would I?" "If you had, I would have told you can't go to it." Cinderella's expression began to crack like the leather on an old glove. "Wait, like what? Hold up. What did you just say?" asked Cinderella. Mara, now seeing everything kind and compassionate in Paul and all of the raving beauty of Paulette baked into this sad, spoiled teenage girl, left alone, abandoned, and scared, repeated, "No, honey, you can't go. You're too young. It's not the place for you." Whether it was the gentleness in Mara's voice or the realization her half-sisters left her behind, Cinderella collapsed into a heap of expensive jeans, shoes, and extensions, and cried a melancholy stream of tears. The old story of the little match girl came to Mara's mind. She heard it read in kindergarten, and it was so deeply disturbing to her that she became feverish and needed to be kept home from school. The image of the little match girl dying alone on a frozen winter street, and her spirit soon lifting out of herself and ascending upward, was almost too much for Mara to bear. She saw Cinderella that way now, despite her wealth and outer shell of designer makeup and mean-spiritedness. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? There's no one. Where's everyone? I'm all alone. What will I do? Cried Cinderella, the orphan girl, so bereft. Mara scooped Cinderella up into her arms. Instinctively, Cinderella hugged Mara back. Will you take care of me, Mara? Of course I will, sweetheart. I won't let anything bad happen to you, Mara comforted. That's why you can't go to the dance. But in a few years, it will be your time, and you'll be so beautiful. I'm so afraid, and everyone makes fun of me. Well, since you're at a new school, how about if we try out the names Cindy, or Ella, or even just Dee Dee, and see if that helps? Okay. Okay? And with a simple affirmation in the form of a nod from the sniffling Cinderella, Mara knew that everything in her life would become as it was meant to be. Her guilt was purged, all curses lifted. The child had found a new home. Paul had loved Paulette, though briefly, and recovered from the emptiness he lived with, knowing in the back of his mind that Mara's thoughts were in the ER. Janny and Kim danced until dawn. Cinderella made pancakes in the kitchen with Mara, carefully pouring and adding strawberries. Mara smiled and thought about the passion in her past, her daughters whom she loved, and Cinderella, the raw new sparkle dropped into the pool of her blessings. Everyone lived happily ever after.